Hello, welcome to the Birth Words Podcast, episode number 6. Today we get to meet my good friend Joanie and hear her birth experience.
You're listening to the Birth Words Podcast. Utah-based birth doula and applied linguistics scholar Sarah Pixton digs into the language of pregnancy and birth to help expectant women claim their power as life-giving agents engaged in a praiseworthy work. This podcast aims to promote positive birth paradigms and is not intended as medical advice.
All right, Joanie, welcome. Thank you so much for coming to be on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited for you all to hear Joanie's story. Joanie is my next door neighbor, and when we moved into our house, she was, 6 months pregnant, and I was like, pregnant person, she'll want to talk about birth. I want to talk about birth all the time, and sometimes people don't necessarily want to engage in those conversations. Pregnant people are pretty good bet for that though, so yes. I was super thrilled. And then it turns out she's awesome aside from just having been pregnant at the time that I moved in. So we've talked about her story a little bit over the past year since Jameson, her son, was born, and I just love the things that she has to say and the wisdom that she has to share and just her awesome experience. So I'm excited to talk with her about it today. So Joanie, my first question is, what words did you use to identify yourself as an expectant mother and then as a laboring mother once you were in labor?
Yeah, so it took a lot of time to find words to identify. Being my first birth, there was a lot of different information out there, and so I did a lot of research. But as I sifted through the research, as I started to form my own identity as a mother, I really, the words that resounded with me as an expecting mother, probably, this is kind of weird, but strong, capable, and like I said, it took me some time to get there, but definitely, I started to really, not only relate to those words, but start to truly believe them as an expecting mother, which there's so much unknown that it is kind of scary. And then, as a laboring mother, those are very interesting. I did a lot of research as well, just preparing for labor, and the words that I related to most and actually thought about most, one of them was primal. I know that's kind of an interesting word to use, but we decided to have an unmedicated birth. And so that was a really helpful way of looking at this experience, more of like back to the basics, the very essence of being a human being, breathing and having that kind of experience with and very much turned inward. And so, yeah, those were definitely, I mean, the other word, sorry, I'm just thinking, but the other word that I came back to a lot as I thought about labor and even throughout labor was gentle. I visualized myself as a very gentle, which is so interesting because the experience I was having was so intense, a very intense physical experience, but yet in my mind, it was a very gentle, I wanted Jameson to have a gentle birth. And so I was very, soft in my mind with the words I spoke to myself. And, so that was those are kind of interesting. As I thought about that question, I thought, oh, that's a very interesting, way to think about it. And just, I didn't think about it until, you asked me that question, but it's definitely different than what you would expect.
I love all the thoughts that you shared. I love thinking back to when I first met you, and you mentioned you did a lot of research to try to figure out, like, who am I going to be as a birth giver? Like, what's going to work for me as an approach? And you were kind of figuring it out when we met, and you talked a little bit about how you'd had some conversations with family members, and you were just trying to sort out how you were going to approach the experience. And I think that you were so thoughtful and so wise about all the research that you did that helped you, that, spoiler alert, have a wonderful experience with your birth. I think that's awesome that you were so thoughtful and just worked so hard at preparing, because it's a really important, life-altering experience.
Yes, I agree.
For it.
Yeah.
The other thing that I thought was interesting with the thoughts that you shared, you talked about the word strong is a word that you used, is that correct, as an expectant mother,
yes.
and you talked about being so soft, especially during the process of the labor and the birth.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because those are pretty contrasting words. And I have to laugh a little bit because I have another client that also chose those words to, like, as she was preparing for her birth, she wanted to hang on to being soft and strong.
Yeah.
And she wrote out some affirmation cards and, like, left them out somewhere in their house. And I don't remember if it was her brother or her brother-in-law. Somebody walked in and was like, "Oh, like the toilet paper commercial." And she was like, "Yeah." So even during her birth, I was like, "You are soft and strong." And, like, everybody was like, and I was like, okay, like, we can laugh about this. Like,
yeah, exactly.
But it's just funny, the associations we have with just these words. But I think it's so true that there's this dichotomy in birth of, like, at the same time you are so strong and yet so gentle. I guess gentle was the word.
Yeah. Yeah.
But cool. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
No problem. So my next question is, as you were preparing through your pregnancy and preparing for birth, did you find that there were ways of thinking or ideas that you kind of had to discard that you'd been exposed to before, or rework to prepare yourself to have a positive birth experience?
Absolutely. Yeah. This is like 100% most of my time spent before my son was born. This is where I spent a lot of it. Especially, so I have a sister who goes to the hospital, gets an epidural, and it's a wonderful experience. She loved all of her births. And then I have a sister who chose to do unmedicated births. And had a wonderful experience. So I was sitting in between those two experiences, and I kept going back and forth. What do I want to do? What do I want to do? And it's an interesting thing. So I started reading books, and I tease people, if you don't want to have an unmedicated birth, do not read birthing books, basically. Ones that are more geared toward unmedicated births, because they are very powerful. It's a very powerful experience to read those in itself. But so I was growing up. This is actually very interesting. I remember as a child, and this is a very random experience, I was in between, awake and asleep. And I was waking up, and I remember thinking, like, one day I'm going to have children. And it was just this fear, intense fear of, like, that is very scary. And so, I mean, obviously fast forward to the time that we were having our child, I still had that fear. There were lots of, I feel like the stories, the birth stories that I've heard, previous of my research, is very just kind of scary, honestly. A little bit more negative than positive. Definitely focused on the kind of the things that could go wrong, or the horrors. I mean, it's like getting your wisdom teeth out. Everyone tells you the horror stories before. Anyway, so I definitely had a lot of fear. And I think that's where the bulk of my research and the bulk of my work before Jameson's birth happened, for sure. So that was a huge framework I had to change. And reading books and talking to other people who have had unmedicated births, and my sisters, and definitely I was able to kind of take that fear out, sit with it, face it, understand it, accept that things could go wrong, that things, it could be really painful. It could be all the things that I was afraid of. And then to feel like, yeah, that's okay. And that was a huge part of being able to then change my mind and the words, especially the thoughts that I had. I mean, it changed from this very negative, scared attitude to this very positive, very capable, very excited, joyful experience. Yeah, it was cool. It's interesting. As soon as I feel like I finally made the decision and decided I'm going to do an unmedicated birth, and I started, facing the fears and trying to work through those, I was able to then move on to, why am I even giving birth? Why do I want to be a mother? Why am I
interesting? And
that opened a whole new thought process and a whole new way of thinking. And and it changed the way that I viewed my birth, and definitely changed it to more of a joyful, exciting experience.
Thank you. That's really interesting how you talked about this opening a door for you to really look at the basic questions of like, okay, why are we doing this? And I think, I don't know what, I'm going to think about this for days, but I think that just like that exercise that you did of like examining your beliefs and where they came from and which ones you were going to discard and which ones you were going to move forward with, and approaching that like really brought you to a place of like, okay, like this is core meaning. So let's like think about the core meaning. That's really interesting. Cool. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Do you have any book recommendations that you would toss out there? What were some of the most influential, helpful ones? Yeah. So I would say there were probably, I did read a lot, and I enjoyed all of them. The two that I know there's a lot more out there than I actually read, but the two that the one that I started with was Ina May's Guide to Childbirth, which I feel like was a perfect one to start with because, the first half is just a bunch of, well, is it the first half or the second half? One half of the book. Sure it's the first. Yeah, it's just a bunch of birth stories. And they're positive birth experiences. And they're so just very inspirational, very emotional, and the way that I felt like I wanted my birth to be. So that was that was awesome for me to be able to read positive experiences. Different than the ones you encounter in movies or TV series or
at baby showers or,
Isn't that sad? That's so sad.
It is. It's kind of sad. But that's so that one is a great one to start with, especially if you're on the fence. Like, do I want to do it unmedicated? I mean, even if you don't, it's still a fantastic book to read. It's great. And then the other one that so I took a hypnobirthing class. So I did read the hypnobirthing book, and it's fantastic. Just the more you know about your own body, the better. And the hypnobirthing book was great for that. Talked about the different muscles of the uterus and just kind of understanding. And I referred to that a lot during the labor process, thought about each like layer of my uterus and opening up. And, but then the one that I actually helped me through a lot of the fear, was, birthing from within.
Okay.
It was
cool.
a really, I think that's where I got the word primal. There's a story in there that talks about a woman who drew a picture of a wolf and just kind of back to the basics of life. And I think, that's probably kind of weird, but it was so helpful for me to have that, mindset going in. So cool. And then there was one that you actually recommended that changed everything. But the gift of giving birth was such an amazing book. I read that till the very end, right before I was giving birth. I was still reading it. It is an incredible book that just kind of, like I said, it helped to shift my mind to, why am I doing this? Why am I giving birth? Why do I want to be a mother? And it was a very, very influential part of my mindset for my birth.
Yeah.
So
cool.
yeah.
Thank you for sharing. That's awesome. Hopefully our listeners can go check some of those out and have positive experiences with them too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So my next question, which if you feel like we've already talked about it, you can just say, like, remember how I just said this, and we'll move on.
Okay.
But going into your birth experience, can you remember any words that you used or that other people used, maybe your husband or your midwife or somebody, or your doula, that helped to frame the experience for you? Like as you're going into the experience of like, this is active labor, the baby's coming.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things, the first thing that comes to mind, I took a hypnobirthing class. And so during the class, one of the things that was most helpful for me, she talked about when things start getting intense, when you are in active labor, how are you going to describe what you're feeling? Mm-hmm. Because a lot of people say pain, and that's okay. You can identify that as pain. But sometimes that can kind of make you tense and kind of, it's kind of hard to do anything when you're tense and stressed. Yeah. So that wasn't a great exercise for me. I decided on the word pressure. And so going into active labor, it was so much easier for me to say, this is a lot of pressure. And it triggered the thought process of my baby's coming. Mm-hmm. This is not for nothing. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's for something. I'm bringing my child into the world. I'm bringing another human being in the world to have a life, to live a life, and to add to the world. So I definitely felt like that was so helpful to beforehand identify what am I going to call my experience? What am I going to call the sensation that I'm feeling during active labor? The other thing I will say, I do remember talking to my doula about that point in active labor that you feel like, I cannot do this. Mm-hmm. And we talked about it, and we talked about how that's usually right before transition, right before you're going to have your baby. And it's very, very intense. Mm-hmm. And so we talked about that, and she talked about what she would do and how she would handle that. And I also talked to my midwife about that. Mm-hmm. And so it was something that I had prepared for, and it did come. Yeah. It did come. And I looked at my midwife and my doula and said, I can't do this. I don't want to do this. Like, somebody help me. And they were so awesome to have that positive outlook as well, and kind of look in my face, in my eyes, and tell me I can do it. You can do this. I'm going to get you through it. We're going to do it together. Just breathe. You're okay. And it was it was the perfect thing for me to be able to go back in, and focus on those words that I had identified and the affirmations I had identified already before. That was very helpful. And while I was thinking about that, I remembered what I was going to say. So the other thing, talking to my sister who had unmedicated births, she described her experience as intense. Mm-hmm. And so, because I had asked her, tell me every detail. I need to know every detail, and that was the way she described it. So going in, it was easy for me to go to that instead of this, like, I'm so scared, I'm afraid, I'm feeling something that I've never felt before. It was much more, wow, this is very intense. This is crazy, but it's awesome. So, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. I feel like with each of those 3 points that you made, that you talked about like a key word or something that you'd planned, like I can't do this, like you'd had the conversation before, that you were ready to shift into this framework that you'd built for yourself. Yes. To have this gentle, powerful, intense, beautiful, positive birth experience. Yeah. And that you made like this path for yourself to be like, okay, like if I start to veer this way, like this is the path to go back to this whole framework. Yeah. And that you had that already built up for you, which is awesome, especially knowing that it wasn't something that was always part of you. It wasn't like, this is like the core framework that I have for recognizing and dealing with and planning for birth. It was this thing that you worked and built up during your pregnancy, and then you were able to rely on all that work you'd done to make that positive headspace.
Yeah.
And use all those positive words that you'd prepared for yourself. That's awesome.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, I just have one last question.
Yeah.
Do you have any other thoughts about words and the role that they played in your birth? It's okay if the answer is no. Or if it's okay if you want to come back in a few months and talk about it some more.
I know, right? I think the thing that I think about the most when it comes to words, it's just that how powerful they can be, especially going into a birth. I decided and I chose to have an unmedicated birth, but even my friends and the people that I know that have had births that weren't unmedicated, that just, they had whatever they chose to do, I think they are so impactful. And I was talking to my husband last night, and I feel like the work that I did in creating that framework and creating that space for a positive birth really made it actually be positive, Yeah. Yeah. I feel like my birth was not perfect. It didn't go exactly, how you think it's going to go. The unexpected things happen, but it was exactly what I wanted because of the space of the mindset I was in going in. And, I knew that if I didn't make it all the way unmedicated, that it was going to be okay, that I was going to be happy and that everything was going to be fine as long as my son and I were both safe and happy. And, that was a huge part of it. So I definitely feel like the work that you put in, and it is work. There's a lot of time I spent thinking and meditating about it and researching and reading. The work is so worth it because I think this is such a life-altering turning point in your life when you have a child, when you become a mother. I think that was, and it was what I wanted because I was in a mindset that I had worked so hard to be in. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. I could jump in and add my 2 cents, but I feel like I would taint your just glorious conclusion. I think that it's one of the reasons birth is just beautiful and awesome to me is that each experience is unique, but we still can resonate with each other's experiences. So thank you for sharing your unique experience that I resonated with. Yes. And thanks for coming to be on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Did words play an important role in your birth experience? If you're interested in sharing your story on the podcast, go to summitbirthutah.com/birthwords. If you're liking what you hear on the podcast, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you choose to listen. For more resources about harnessing the power of words to benefit the birth experience, visit summitbirthutah.com/birthwords.